Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. For the past 2 months, I started work on another game. It's nothing like what I made before, so I'm excited to show you. The first 2 days were spent getting some preliminary stuff out of the way, like setting up a player. For this project, I decided on a bit of a different art style. For the past few games on this channel, I worked in 3D, but for basically all my other 2D projects, I've gone with pixel art. I made an enemy spawner, and I got some enemies following the player. On day 2, I made some quick animations and implemented a simple gun to kill the baddies with. Then I made a timer for the wave and a warning effect for when an enemy spawns. Day 3 was spent adding some proper framework for different weapon types. I created these scriptable objects, which allow me to super easily create new weapons. I added support for a spread weapon and a value for the angle that it shoots at. I also gave the player a health bar so the enemies could deal damage. After day 5, I had enemies dropping coins and a fully working shop system. For this game, I went with the idea of the player buying stat upgrades and new weapons, as well as being able to upgrade the existing weapons they had. Day 6 was spent adding a shot counter and implementing weapon reloading. I thought it would be an interesting choice to force the player to be careful with the ammo they used, so they wouldn't run out of it when they needed it most. The bulk of this day was spent making an AI that would force the enemies to avoid the player. An easy way to implement this is to take the direction from the enemy to the player and simply move the opposite way. However, when the enemy reaches a wall, they get stuck and the player can catch up with them. To avoid this, I first have to talk a little bit about vectors. Vectors have both a direction and a magnitude. And when you want to move in a certain direction, you usually normalize it first. This means that you set the magnitude to 1. An example of why is that I want my enemy to move at the same speed the whole time. Since the magnitude of this vector is the distance between the player and the enemy, not normalizing the direction can cause the enemy to move faster the further away the player is. This can be used to our advantage, however. If I add a few vectors together and then normalize the result, the magnitude of the vectors can act as a sort of a weight. The larger the magnitude, the more that certain vector will influence the final direction. To get the enemy to avoid the walls as well as the player, I got the direction of the walls. Then I essentially inverted all of the magnitudes. What this did was cause the smaller magnitudes to have a greater influence over the final movement direction, meaning that the enemy would avoid the walls if they were super close, or it would avoid the player if it was super close. On day 7, I made a setting for enemies with projectiles to predict the position of the player. On day 8, I exposed the player's current stats in the shop and allowed each item to display its stats as well. Day 9 was spent moving the health bar, and I implemented a cannon. This was just meant to be a concept, and it showed that I would be able to have all sorts of explosive weapons. On day 10, I added colored text to the shop. It was much more clear seeing when certain items increased or decreased the player's stats. I also added a damage over time weapon. When its projectile collides with something, it spawns a ring that deals a certain amount of damage every second to the enemies that are inside. I also tried my best to implement a melee weapon. I initially thought of a sword that swipes from the side, but it didn't feel very powerful or like a sword. I thought instead of having a swipe that launched straight out of the player, and I spent far too long trying to figure out the math. I had some pretty amusing failures though. By day 11, I finally had the shockwave working properly. At the end of day 13, I had created these enemies I called bashers. They followed the player like regular enemies, but they launched themselves at you, and they feel pretty fun to try and avoid. I also added the ability for them to predict the player's future position. On day 14, I finalized my wave system. I have a single scriptable object which contains an array of waves. Each of these waves also has its own array of mini waves. Each mini wave has a duration and a start offset. They also contain a list of enemies that it chooses to randomly spawn. This simple system allows me to have essentially any wave I can imagine. On day 15, I reworked the wide weapon and implemented it into the base ranged weapon, so all the weapons could inherit this property. I also removed the reloading feature because it didn't serve any purpose except to be annoying. I also added a slider to show the shock cooldown. Before this, some of the slower weapons felt really weird to use, and the visualization solved this problem. Finally, I added one more explosive weapon that I called the Spitfire. Days 16 and 17 were spent improving the shop. I added rarities to the items and weapons, which improved the look and would also make it easier to balance later. I also allowed the player to re-roll the shop for a small fee, and added the option to lock the shop for the next round. Days 18 through 20 were spent implementing the first boss. I wasn't super creative with the first idea, and stuck with the generic red enemy. I had the idea for the boss fight to have this huge invincible spiky red ball bouncing around. The boss slowly follows the player around and spawns some more enemies to chase the player as well. When the boss reaches 50% health, then he stops and creates another spiky ball. I also wanted to add the boss jumping up and slamming on top of the player, but I ran out of time. Overall, it was still a fun boss to make and also to fight. So that was everything that I had time for. I probably won't continue with this game, at least not in the near future, but who knows, maybe I'll change my mind. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.